Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. Can a leopard ever change its spots? Well, today's podcast is entitled, Can You Change Your Personality? It's part of a series on personality and the building of character. I've subtitled the series Be the Best You Can Be because, in my opinion, building character is the best way to fulfill our most important of desires, to maximise well-being for ourselves and for those around us. In podcast 1 of this series, we discussed what personality is. To summarise quickly, personality traits can be understood as a preference system. These traits predispose us to like or dislike something, to prefer one thing over another, to approach or avoid situations, and so on and so on. As such, they motivate us, they predispose us emotionally. And a key thing, these preferences typically happen outside conscious awareness. They're deep biases that are subsequently reflected in our thinking. In this way, we're all unavoidably biased, and our resulting thinking tends to rationalise what we're already feeling. Further, most psychologists agree on a personality framework called the Big Five. Mountains of research have validated these 5 dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. And the consensus is that collectively, these 5 dimensions explain most of the variance in personality. So, for example, the introvert tends to avoid crowds or strangers when they're given the choice, and the person who's very open to experience seeks novelty and change and gets bored with repetition. So these predispositions show up in predictable patterns of behaviour, thought and feeling, and when we're at extremes of any of the dimensions, that shows up as predictable strengths and predictable distortions in how we relate to reality. And central to our topic today, there is broad agreement that personality is largely hereditable and doesn't change a lot over the average lifespan. But of late, there's very important research that questions the idea that personality traits, trait being permanent, state being temporary, may in fact be changeable. For example, the work of Nathan Hudson and his colleagues and a new book by Olga Kazan, it's called Me But Better, The Science and Promise of Personality Change, are somewhat changing the conversation by suggesting we can change personality. Kind of. Kind of? Well, that, as far as I'm concerned, is the really interesting part. My conviction is that we don't change the deeply wired preference system per se, but we do wire in changes via the human superpower of neuroplasticity. And what's neuroplasticity? It's the way that patterns of connectivity in the brain and nervous system are shaped by practice. In other words, when we practice something the same way over and over, that pattern becomes easier to activate and eventually can become automaticized. It will run itself, given the appropriate stimulus or situation. It then starts to feel like instinct or becomes trait-like. This is very much like a software patch applied to a computer operating system. We can't change the operating system, but we can add software updates. The operating system stays the same, but in very specific ways, for quite specific circumstances, it can be overwritten. So, an example from my life, I'm a strong introvert, so very low on extroversion. Great weekend for me is time at home, alone, or in the garden. I love people, but in small numbers. Now, some years ago, I had a wonderful opportunity to do public speaking on creativity to large crowds internationally, being paid very good money too. It was stimulating, exciting and flattering, but also very uncomfortable for me. But the overall cost-benefit analysis made it clear I wanted to do it. So I practiced a lot. Over 7 to 8 years, I did hundreds of talks, sometimes with 2,000 plus crowds. Guess what? I got better and better at it and started to enjoy it, even looking forward to it. So was I now an extrovert? By no means. My recalibration was quite specific. it was public speaking or running public seminars. In every other respect, I revert to my natural introversion. To this day, I eat evening meals in my hotel room if I'm travelling. I put headphones on in the plane or in the lounge. I prefer quiet weekends at home. I talk to one or two people at a party. I don't work the room, and so on. Now, studies purporting to show that you can change personality rely on questionnaires that measure the Big Five. However, like a lot of psych tests, if you understand the concepts behind the questions, you can alter your response to be more acceptable to yourself or others, what we call faking good. Now, especially if you've been deliberately, consciously, and conscientiously recalibrating your feelings, thoughts, and actions to change a natural preference, like I did with public speaking, you'll then answer the questions relevant to that practice quite differently. Measures of the Big Five personality traits are pretty reliable, but as we recalibrate, I'm pretty sure that one's scores on the Big Five would also change. But does that mean our underlying personality has changed? Or does it mean that despite our underlying personality, we've made significant, important adaptations by this kind of conscious practicing of different ways of thinking, feeling, and acting in the world? Well, I think the answer is the latter. Now, I call this recalibration because it's quite conscious initially. I recalibrate my natural reaction to that specific context. I received enough good feedback and positive experiences in public speaking that it was positively reinforcing. I've done it so much, I don't have to think about it much anymore. So, what are these recent studies on personality change telling us? Well, basically, if you put in the hard yards and really practice mindfully over a long period of time, you'll get the kind of changes I just described. The difference is the authors tend to describe it as changing personality. But again, have I become extroverted? No. Why can I say that so confidently? Because in every other context and situation, I revert to introversion. So it's just like a software patch that has a very specific overwriting of my underlying operating system. Now, am I splitting hairs? I don't think so. I think there are some very important implications of this, especially in being realistic about what can be achieved. Now, I don't want to relitigate old debates, but it's enough to say that there are very emotive and very consequential arguments about nature versus nurture that often see theories of genetic influence as being somewhat degrading or immoral, that we're justifying inequalities and limiting people's freedom to better themselves and so on. So people, for example, may argue from a strong egalitarian point of view, and according to this view, we're not born different, it's society that makes us so. Therefore, if we change the environment, this is the blank slate hypothesis, we can become anything we want to be. Now, I've clearly exaggerated that to make a general point. Most parents who've had multiple children will tell you, as does the research in behavioural genetics, the kids are just born different. To be clear, even with inherited personalities, the environment is super, super important. In every example of real observed changes in how people can think, feel and act in ways that aren't typical of their inherited personality, nurture is always responsible. We can make small but extremely important targeted adjustments that make all the difference. But it's not wholesale personality change. Believing that will set you up for failure and for grief. So by contrast, here's what I think we should do once we understand and fully accept our natural personality. We should first locate ourselves in environments that suit us. This is occupations, physical environments, social and community groups, and most importantly, relationships. Personality environment fit really does the heavy lifting in terms of being effective and happy in life. Second, we should seek to curate that environment to suit us even more. Where possible, we should cultivate work and especially relationships that cause less friction with our natural style. And then, thirdly, we ought to recalibrate our own system for the specific areas of mismatch or abrasion in our life where this slow, mindful work is really worth it to us. Most personality changes, therefore, are incremental, not global, and they overwrite the underlying system. Now, there are some general developmental changes that have been observed across the lifespan. For example, we tend to become less neurotic or we become more agreeable as we age. And I think that potentially life experiences tend to moderate our extremes. They educate us, and over time, many of us wire in better adaptations. But generally, overall, personality is pretty stable. But thinking about it, I guess these changes can also happen in the opposite direction. Some people get, quote, worse, or at least more delightfully themselves as they age, in that they become more extreme. How's this? Well, if they can manage to structure the world to keep rewarding their preferences, they may become more like themselves. I think we can see this in the super rich and the powerful. Think of your favourite politicians, tech moguls, oligarchs, stars, and so on. These extremes come with talents, but also distortions, and these distortions can be amplified inside echo chambers of their own making or inside, for example, online groups that they seek out. So, to the question, do leopards change their spots? Well, no, obviously. But is that the right question? Can we change for the better? Absolutely, and we ought to. It starts by understanding and accepting your personality, placing that personality in environments that suit it, making changes to the environments to further suit you, and then making changes to yourself to better adapt to the world. Now, perhaps the most important change is to reduce our egocentric bias. That's our tendency to uncritically believe our own perspective and, for example, assume that others are or should be just like us. It's a way we project our own views and thoughts and feelings onto others, and then we get disappointed when, surprise, surprise, they're not like us. So where does this egocentric bias come from? Well, we can assume that when we depart significantly from the mean on personality dimensions, there will be strengths this provides, but also systematic distortions in how we perceive and appraise reality. This is especially apparent when we encounter people at the opposite extremes of these dimensions. We may peer at such people with blinking incomprehension. Usually, we moralise about them. For example, people high on openness, creative types, for example, can find those low on openness boring. Those low on openness may find these creative types crazy, even dangerous. Extroverts can find introverts weird. Introverts can find extroverts tiresome. And emotionally stable folk find sensitive types neurotic and wonder, what's all the fuss about? While sensitive types find very emotionally stable people quite cold or distant. So, what should we do about this? Well, firstly, knowledge is power. Understanding accurately our own distortions and also the strengths of other people's perspectives is a natural corrective. Secondly, when we recognise that we and others don't choose our personalities and may not be aware of our own perspectives as perspectives, this creates tolerance. We're all thrown into this world with variously coloured, tinted glasses. This may well be the most important dimension of diversity, equity and inclusion, considering how much trouble personality conflicts cause. Now, all of this leads to not only the questions of how to change, but what will guide these changes? What's the goals or purposes for these changes? And why bother? Certainly to aid in one's own better adaptation, but also to create a better world around us. It's a form of enlightened self-interest. And to that end, in the next podcast, I'll continue this discussion and explore the topic of character development. After all, if we're recalibrating our inherited personality, if we are somewhat changing our being in the world, what should be the goal of these changes? Spoiler alert, I suspect wise living is the answer. In the meantime, think about your own personality and what needs tweaking. We can all do with some improvement, and that's what we'll explore next. And take it easy until the next podcast. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life, and click on the videos tab to find links to all my social media. And if you like the podcast, tell people that you like so they can like it too.